family. Opal, via Lieben Autos.
Welcome back. On our political panel this morning, joining me is the Liberal MP Steve Ciobo and Labor MP Kelvin Thompson. Good morning to both of you, gentlemen. We'll start with Australia's bid for a spot on the UN Security Council. Steve Ciobo, Julia Gillard says this has cost us about $24 million over 5 years. It doesn't sound like too much in federal government terms.
Well, look, this is just more spending. It was, of course, originally a pipe dream of Kevin Rudd's, and now Julia Gillard is desperately trying to save face and continue it going. The point is, though, David, Calvin and I had the unique privilege of both being delegates to the United Nations at the end of last year. When you're over there and you talk to people on the ground, one thing's very clear, and that is for us to have had any chance of securing a seat on the Security Council, we needed to lock in the support from our region. But this government is so inept when it comes to managing our relationships. Look at the way in which they mishandled live export to Indonesia. Look at the problems they've got now with Malaysia. On so many levels, they've cost us any sort of support in our region, which is now, of course, also going to be made more difficult because the Europeans are unlikely to back us. So, frankly, this is going to be a tens of millions of dollars exercise in futility that will come to naught, I suspect.
Kelvin Thompson, what does Australia get out of the a place on the Security Council if Australia even gets that position, which looks somewhat unlikely, you'd have to say?
Well, I think, David, that the Security Council continues to play a very important role in world affairs. So the decisions made at the United Nations are effectively made by the Security Council. You see the discussions that have been going on in relation to Syria now for the past year. The action there is clearly at the Security Council. But whether the bid is successful or unsuccessful, I think it's been a very important exercise for Australia in raising its international profile. And last year, when Steve and I were at the UN General Assembly, I was very impressed by the work being done by our staff at the UN mission in promoting Australia's candidature and lifting Australia's international profile. I do think that our reputation is in good working order. We are just about the only country which has been lifting its aid budget through the period of the global financial crisis. I feel we have a reputation as a country who can be trusted, that we do what we say, and so it seems to me that we still have a chance. It's an interesting place. We saw the vote there last year, and it's a seriously secret ballot. Some countries couldn't even be sure that their ambassador had voted the way that the country was indicating it was going to vote. So like those grand finals next weekend, we'll just have to see what the result is.
Steve Ciobo, Kelvin Thompson there mentioned Australia's increase in aid funding, and particularly to Africa. Can that be seen as anything other than an attempt to buy votes from the African nations?
Oh, look, I don't want to politicise foreign aid in that way. The reality is that I always think that countries do their best by not necessarily looking to make budget savings by cutting funding to among the poorest in the world. But there's no doubt that what Kevin Rudd did do was change Australia's focus of foreign aid so that we were less focused on the millions and millions of people in desperate need in our part of the world and push the focus onto Africa. People might look at that and question, well, what is the priority there? But fundamentally the issue is this, David. You're still talking about this government, once again, consistent with past form, spending tens of millions of dollars on an exercise that is going to come to naught. And I just think it's a great shame that this government, frankly, doesn't take a little bit more care with taxpayers' money and doesn't spend a little bit more time thinking how could we actually use this money more effectively instead of chasing glorified outcomes that make Kevin Rudd or Julia Gillard look, or think, more importantly, that they're some kind of international player.
Kelvin Thompson, there has been some criticism of not just Kevin Rudd but also Bob Carr for not spending enough time in the region since taking on the position of Foreign Minister. He has been all over the world, including on the Syrian border and elsewhere, but hasn't spent too much time in the Pacific. Is that criticism warranted?
No, it's certainly not, David. I think that both Bob Carr and Kevin Rudd, as his predecessor, have been very active internationally right around the globe, including in the Pacific. And I think as a consequence of that action, that Australia's international reputation, both in the region and more broadly, is in good working order. And of course, the aid budget needs to and is directed at the places of greatest need, and it is the right thing to do to be lifting our aid budget towards that United Nations target of 0.7 of 1% of gross national income.
Steve Ciobo, just before we move on, just want to be clear, do you actually support the bid in itself? Has this been a worthwhile attempt made? Does it have bipartisan support, I suppose, is what I'm asking?
Well, we're not opposed to the bid that's being made, David, but the point really, and I just want to pick up on what Calvin just said, is that, you know, this exercise is not going to work, and the reason why it most likely is not going to work is if you look at where we could have engendered the bulk of our support, which is from our part of the world. I mean, Labor is just mismanaging our relationships. I mean, you saw relations between Australia and China, for example, you know, unfortunately spiralled downwards as a consequence of Kevin Rudd's lack of stewardship. You see the way in which Julia Gillard has so badly managed our relationship with Indonesia. Now, these are massive countries that are very big players in what they call the G77. That's a block of countries in the United Nations, and we would need to get their support in order to be successful. But we're not going to get their support because this government, Labor, has not done a good job at managing those important relationships in our region.
OK, I want to move on to issues closer to home. And speaking of relationships, relations between Queensland and the federal government, which seem to have taken another turn for the worst. There are threats this morning being reported in the Australian newspaper being made by the Newman government to bring in 300,000 odd small business workers back under the state IR laws. Currently they operate under federal laws. This is being seen by many as retaliation to Bob Carr's announcement on Friday that the government would try and lock in the pay and condition of public servants in Queensland in particular, whose jobs were being outsourced to the private sector. Kelvin Thompson, what justification was there, first of all, for Bill Shorten to be for sort of meddling, I suppose, in the workplace laws that are in place in Queensland with those public servants that are employed under the Queensland government?
Well, Labor does believe in fairness in the workplace, and we believe that Queensland public servants are entitled to appropriate protections of their wages and conditions. I wonder how many of the 300,000 small business employees in Queensland who are potentially at risk in terms of salaries and conditions, should the Queensland Attorney-General make good on his threat, were conscious of this at the time of the last Queensland state election. Frankly, it seems to me that we have a Queensland government which is drunk with power and is prepared to attack the wages and conditions of both public sector and small business employees. We don't believe that's the right thing to do. We believe that wages and conditions of employment are entitled to protection, and we're prepared to legislate to achieve that.
Doesn't Campbell Newman, though, Kelvin Thompson, have the right to streamline a public service which is very widely regarded as being pretty bloated at the moment, and potentially Campbell Newman pay the political price for it as well?
We don't think that ordinary public servants and all ordinary small business employees should pay the price in relation to this. There was not a discussion of this prior to the last state election. You just kind of hear that story about we will cut wasteful government spending, but it turns out everyone's in favour of cutting wasteful government spending, but it turns out that when you've got Liberal governments, that wasteful government spending means jobs, means education, means health, means services. We don't think that's the right path to go. We believe in protecting these entitlements.
Steve Ciobo, Campbell Newman's cuts in Queensland haven't been popular at all, of course, and whether this is political or not, this move by Bill Shorten, first of all, it's not going to be nice for the Coalition to vote against locking in better pay and conditions for workers. Will the Coalition actually vote against these laws being proposed by Bill Shorten?
Well, David, I mean, I just listened to Calvin's rhetoric just then, and if you want a clear example of the way in which Labor's trying to manipulate this to try to extract every ounce of political capital out of it they can, just listen to Calvin's answer. I mean, we heard lines coming from Calvin like an attack on wages. I mean, seriously. Does anyone think that the Queensland government is attacking wages? No, they're not. Let's be clear about what's happening in Queensland. As a Queenslander, I feel like I'm in a position where I can shed some light on this, David. The redundancies and the job losses in the Queensland public service have been less than the number of new public servants employed in the final term of the Bligh Labor government. Now, bear in mind that the Bligh Labor government left this state on track on a forecast to reach $100 billion of debt. That's an unsustainable level for Queensland. Bear in mind too, federal Labor has got us $145 billion in debt, with another $120 billion of unfunded commitments that they've made. So make no mistake, people need to understand that there is a choice here between federal Labor and, it was repeated at a state government Labor level, of more debt, more spending, and just saying, yep, whatever you want, you can have, versus those that live in the real world, people like Campbell Newman, people like the Coalition, who say this has got to be sustainable. We just can't keep spending money.
OK, well, just back to my question, though. Will the Coalition vote against Bill Shorten's attempts to lock in the pay and conditions of particularly Queensland workers?
Well, we want to see the legislation. I mean, Bill Shorten can strut around like a peacock on a stage because he thinks that that's going to help him with the ACTU, and he thinks it's going to help him with the AW and other union members as part of his grand plan to become leader of the Labor Party. That's what this is actually about. It's about internal political posturing by a former Labor leader who's now, or Labor union leader I should say, who now wants to become Labor leader of the parliamentary wing. That's all this is about.
OK, on asylum seekers over the weekend, we saw 16 Sri Lankans opt to go home, go back to Sri Lanka rather than be sent to Nauru for processing. Steve Ciobo, is this an indication that offshore processing on Nauru is starting to have an impact, albeit a small one?
What this is a sign of, David, is that a lot of asylum seekers that are coming to this country are not genuine refugees. They're people here who are trying to take advantage of Labor's soft laws. That's the reason why we've had 24,000 people, nearly a small town, come to Australia, why we've had 450 boats. And bear in mind this, David, Wayne Swan, as part of his attempt to get the budget back into surplus, predicted that there would be 5,400 asylum seekers for the year. That was what he predicted as part of his budget surplus calculations. We've had more than that in the first quarter. So that just underscores how this government's massive blowouts are occurring when it comes to their failed border protection policies, which of course will undermine the surplus and put us once again back into deficit.
Kelvin Thompson, it is going to blow a hole in the budget, isn't it, if 5,400 have already arrived in just 3 months? That number was budgeted for the entire year, as Steve Ciobo pointed out.
Yes, but the government's estimates are going to be released in the mid-year economic forecasts, and they will deal with the question of deficit. The fact is that we've got 3 credit ratings agencies giving Australia a AAA credit rating for the first time in our history. We had our budget strategy backed by the International Monetary Fund just last week. I think a lot of Australians would be very concerned to hear Steve Ciobo talking about the federal debt in the same context that he talks about the Queensland state debt. That suggests to me that the Liberal Party has an agenda to cut Commonwealth public servants in exactly the same way the Queensland government has cut Queensland public servants.
This overblown rhetoric is ridiculous, Calvin. Serves you right.
You're the one who's saying there's a federal debt problem. There is not a federal debt problem. We are in much better shape than other countries around the world. And the fact that you say that there's a federal debt problem suggests to me that you intend to cut public service jobs in just the same way as the Queensland government has been cutting Queensland jobs. OK, just in the minute or so we've got left, just back on asylum seekers, Kelvin Thompson, do you think that there are some initial signs that Labor's policy on asylum seekers is starting to work, with these 16 on the weekend, but also, according to some, a reduction in the surge that we saw over the past month or so, that so-called fire sale? Is that coming to an end? Well, I hope so, David. I think it would be in everybody's best interests, including people who are thinking of getting on boats themselves, if they did not do that, and if we do see a stop to the kind of activity that we saw in the months beforehand. But it is early days, and I do regret the fact that we've effectively had a lost year since the High Court struck down the Malaysia decision and we could not get the parliamentary support from the Liberals and the Greens to pass legislation concerning offshore processing. I think we did have a significant period of lost time that we're trying to make up for now.
OK, Kelvin Thompson, Steve Ciobo, we're out of time, but thanks so much for your insight this morning on
Thanks,
AM
David.
Agenda. And Kieran Gilbert will have all the latest updates from the ground in New York, and we will, of course, have all the news headlines coming up right after this. I'm David Lipson. Thanks for watching.